Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Conversational AI with Rasa series. In this video, we will talk about slots. Slots are one of the most powerful features in Rasa that enables your assistant to collect important pieces of information and use them in a specific context. In simple words, slots are your assistant's memory. So for example, a detail like user's destination is a very important detail for a flight booking assistant. So just like we have in this example where the user says that they would like to book a flight ticket to Sydney, a detail called Sydney could be extracted as a slot and later on used by your assistant when making a booking. So how are the slots defined? You have to define your slots in a domain.yaml file of your assistant and provide the following information: the slot name, slot type, a parameter which defines whether or not the slot should influence the flow of the conversation, and slot mappings. We will cover all of these parameters in more detail in the later stages of this episode. There are two main ways of how slots can be set using Rasa. One of them is using NLU. Depending on how you configure your slot mappings, slots can be set, for example, using the values of the extracted entities. In other cases, slots might be set using specific values if a certain intent has been predicted and similar. All of that depends on how you configure your slot mappings. We will talk about that a little bit more later on in this episode. The second way to set slots with Rasa is using custom actions. We will cover that later on in the series. It's a big topic, so we would like to dedicate an actual episode to that. But just to give you a brief understanding of how this works. In some cases, you would like your assistant to connect to the database and extract some details, or make an API call and get some details like that. Those details can be set as slots and used later on in the conversation in a specific context. You can achieve that using custom actions, but as I said, we will cover that a little bit later in the series. In addition to just storing the pieces of information, slots can be used to influence the flow of the conversation. It's an extremely important and powerful feature of slots in Rasa. You can define this behavior by configuring the flag influence conversation in your slot configuration. The way slots influence the conversation highly depends on the type of the slot, and we will talk about those details a little bit later in this episode. In some situations, you would like your assistant to drive the conversation in a specific way, depending on whether or not specific detail has been provided, or depending on the value of that specific detail. Let me give you a very simple and quick example of that. We have a user that would like to book a ticket to New York. If an assistant gets the detail of the destination, in this case New York, with the initial message of the user, an assistant can go ahead and check for the available flights. In an alternative situation where the user starts the conversation with saying, "Hi, I would like to book a flight ticket," an assistant will need to ask for the destination to be able to proceed and find an applicable option. This is just a very simple example of how your assistant can drive the conversation differently depending on the presence of a specific detail. In those kind of situations, you should consider configuring your slots to influence the flow of the conversation. However, remember to be mindful of when you configure specific slots to influence the flow of the conversation. A general rule of thumb that you should use is to configure your slots to not influence the conversation flow if you don't have a specific valid reason of why a specific slot should have an influence on how a dialogue management model makes predictions. And here I have another quick example of how the situation of where the slot should not influence the flow of the conversation can be configured and where it should be used. Again, we have a flight booking assistant, and in this case, assistant is able to extract one additional detail from the user inputs. It's the username. So in this example, we have a user Anna, and she says, "Hi, I would like to book a ticket to New York." This detail name is not very crucial for our assistant in this very specific case, and that's why assistant responds with, "Hi, which date would you like to travel?" In a different situation where the user doesn't provide their name and simply asks for a flight ticket, just because this slot would be configured to not influence the conversation, an assistant would respond exactly the same way. If you configure specific slots to influence the flow of the conversation, you will have to include them in your training stories to teach your assistant how to drive the conversation based on the behavior of your slots. This can be done by including steps slot was set inside of your training stories and providing the details about the slots and the values that should be set at specific state of the conversation. For example, here we have a story booking a flight ticket, which represents the situation where a slot destination has to be filled after a user asks for a flight to be booked. Here, I would like to highlight OR statement inside of this training story. OR statement represents Rasa feature called OR slot values. This feature allows you to define lots of different situations where certain slots will be set by writing less stories. So for example, this story represents a situation where a slot destination might be filled in by either value Toronto or London after intent book a ticket has been triggered. Or slot values feature gives you a lot of freedom, more flexibility, and requires you to write less stories to cover more different situations. But be mindful when using this feature, because overusing OR statements might lead to much longer training times. If you tend to use a lot of OR statements in your training stories, it's a good signal that you should go back to your domain file and restructure it. Now let's talk about slot mappings. Slot mappings is a very powerful feature in Rasa Open Source, which allows you to define how each slot will be filled in. So for example, if you want specific slots to be filled in with the values of specific entities, you can define that behavior with slot mappings. Or you might want to add additional constraints, for example, use only specific intents to fill in the slots, etc. In general, slot mappings are applied after each user message as the conversation goes. Now, let me give you a very simple example just to illustrate how slot mappings work, and later on we will dive deeper into different slot mapping types and all the details. So let's say in our domain file we have the following configuration. In our slots list, we have a slot called amount of money, and we have a mapping configuration for it. The type for this mapping is from entity, which, as the name suggests, means that this slot will be filled in with the value extracted from an entity. Down below, we have the actual entity name that will be used to fill in the slot, which is number. And we also have two additional constraints for this slot mapping. We have an intent, make transaction, which means that this slot mapping will be applied only if the specific intent is predicted. And we also have not intent constraint with the value check transaction, which means that if intent check transaction is predicted, the slot mapping will not be applied. So let's say we have two user messages. One says send $200 to Ben, and another one says, did I receive the $1,000 that Alice sent me yesterday? Both of these messages have an entity, number. The first one with a value $200 and another one with a value $1,000. So we could say that both of these messages could potentially fill in the amount of money slot. But just because we have these additional constraints for intent and not intent, the first message will actually be used to fill in the amount of money slot because it will have the intent make transaction. While the second message, which will be classified as intent check transaction, will not be used to fill in the following slot. Now, let's talk about different slot mapping types that are available in Rasa. The first one is from entity slot mapping. This slot mapping fills in the slots based on the extracted entities. So for example, if you have an LU model that is trained to extract entities, you can use from entity slot mapping to fill in the slots using the values of extracted entities. When using the slot mapping, you can configure some additional parameters. For example, you can add role and group constraints, which means that the mapping will be applied if the extracted entity has a specific role and a specific group. You can also define an intent, which means that the mapping will be applied only when the intent is predicted. And you can also add a not intent constraint, which means that the mapping will not be applied when this specific intent is predicted. Next, we have slot mapping from text. From text, slot mapping is quite unique because it allows you to use the text of the latest user message to fill in the slot. Here, once again, you can add some additional parameters like an intent or not intent. Next slot mapping available in Rasa Open Source is from intent. Just as the name suggests, this slot mapping is based on the predicted intents, and it works in the following way. The slot will be filled with a specific predefined value, which you have to define when you configure the slot mapping, if a specific intent is predicted. Just like with the previously covered slot mappings, you can also add additional constraint, not intent. Another available slot mapping in Rasa is from trigger intent. This slot mapping is sort of related to Rasa forms that we will cover later on in the series. But just a very high-level overview of how this works. Some intents in Rasa might trigger a form. A form, in very simple words, is a mechanism implemented in Rasa Open Source which allows your assistant to collect necessary information from the user in order to run a specific action. In some situations, you might want to fill in the slot when the form is triggered. And from trigger intent, slot mapping allows you to do exactly that. This mapping will fill in a slot with a specific predefined value if a form is activated by a user message with a specific intent. And just like with almost everything in Rasa Open Source, you can customize things. If none of the predefined slot mappings fit your use case and you need something more specific, you can create your own custom slot mappings. To do that, you can use slot validation actions, which are a special case of custom actions. We will cover that a little bit later in the series. But to configure the custom slot mapping, all you have to provide in your domain file is a mapping type, which is custom, and the action name, which will be used for slot mappings. As I have mentioned probably quite a few times now, the way slots can influence the conversation highly depends on the type of the slot. And this is what I would like to talk about now. There are quite a few slot types at Rasa, and which slot type to use highly depends on the type of detail that you would like your assistant to store and use. I would like to go through all the slot types available in Rasa Open Source and explain a little bit more of how they work and in what situations they are the best to use. And I would like to start with a text slot. Text slot can be used to store any text values. The slot can be configured to influence the conversation using the influence conversation flag. A very important note here is that the actual value of the slot will have no influence on how the conversation goes. For text slots, only the presence or the absence of a specific detail will have influence on how the conversation goes if the slot is configured to influence the conversation. The best example of the usage of text slot is the one that we have just discussed, the flight booking assistant. So if the user provides their destination when requesting the flight ticket to be booked, and this detail is extracted and set as a slot, an assistant can use the detail and go ahead and look for applicable options. In a different situation where the user didn't provide the detail, an assistant should probably respond with what is your destination. Next slot type that is available in Rasa is a boolean slot. This slot is the best to store the information that can get two values, true or false. The slot can also be configured to influence the conversation depending on whether or not this is necessary. A very simple example that I have to illustrate of how boolean slot works is when the user provides their user ID, an assistant in the background can check if the user is authenticated to access specific information. And if the user is, then an assistant can proceed in responding and performing specific actions. If the user is not authenticated, an assistant will probably respond with something else, asking to provide additional details or telling the user that they are not authenticated and that there are another necessary steps needed for the user to take. As you can see, the definition and configuration of the slot type boolean is very similar to the previously covered text slot, but there is a very big difference in how these slots work. For boolean slot, it's actually the value that will influence the conversation if the slot is configured that way. Moving on, the next slot type available in Rasa is a categorical slot. Categorical slot is perfect to store the values that can get one of possible n values. This slot can also influence the conversation, and here again the value of the slot will be the important piece that will influence how the conversation goes. A very simple example of how the slot can be used is a restaurant booking assistant. The user would like to get a table in a restaurant that is within the medium price range. Assistant extracts the detail as a slot and uses that to make the search a little bit more specific. Slot type float can be used to store any numerical values. This slot type can also influence the conversation, and here again, the value of the slot will be an important piece that will influence how the conversation goes. As you can see, you can define the minimum and the maximum value that the provided slot can obtain. If the user provides a value for the slot that is lower than the defined minimum value, that value will be set to the minimum value, and the same for the maximum. A very simple example of the usage of the slot is the restaurant booking assistant. Here, the user would like to find a restaurant within the 10 miles radius. If assistant extracts this detail and stores this detail as a slot, then an assistant can use that detail later on to optimize the search. Another slot type that is available in Rasa Open Source is list slot. This slot is quite interesting because it allows you to store lists of values. The slot can also be configured to influence the flow of the conversation, and the way it works is quite similar to the previously discussed text slot. For list slots, the value of the slot will have no influence on how the conversation goes. It's the presence or the absence of the provided detail what matters. Another important detail is that the length of the list will have no influence on how the conversation goes, meaning that it doesn't matter how many values your assistant stored in the list. A very simple example of the usage of list slot is an assistant that allows the user to buy groceries. So when the user says that they would like to buy chocolate, milk, and cookies, an assistant will extract details like chocolate, milk, and cookies as entities under the same name items. If you have a slot that is configured as a list slot, your assistant will be able to extract all of these details under that specific slot. And then your assistant can use those details to add them to the shopping list. And the last slot type that I would like to cover today is a slot type any. This slot can be used to store any arbitrary values that you would like your assistant to keep in the memory and use in a specific context. A very important piece about slot type any is that this slot will never have any influence on how the conversation goes, which means that this slot is the best to simply store the values that you would like your assistant to have the access to. An additional configuration that I wanted to cover is a configuration called initial value. With initial value parameter, you can define a specific initial value that would be assigned to your slot at the beginning of the conversation. This value will stay assigned to your slot until the value of the slot is being reset by an LU or custom actions. The slots stay set until the end of the conversation or until they are reset by the NLU or your custom actions. The values themselves can be used in a specific context and are also available to be used in assistance responses and custom actions. We will cover all that in the later episodes of the Conversational AI with Rasa series, so I hope I'll see you there.